So I'm glad you mentioned it because I actually had a question for you about these two stories. I mean, will China will celebrate with great fanfare the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party this year. And in a recent column you wrote that in some ways this year made you think of 1949, when as well Mao Zedong, then the founder of the People's Republic of China at that time, told one sort of soothing story to a more international audience, but at the same time a deeply, deeply political story domestically. And you said that those events remind you of the events today. So can you explain what these two stories are and which story is closer to the truth of how Chinese leaders really see the world?
So if you go back to 1949, the founding year of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party had a problem, because in order to enthuse and motivate ordinary Chinese to join this revolution, they had to explain that it was going to change everything. That if you currently did not have land, if you were at the bottom of society, if you were a worker who felt oppressed, everything was going to change. There was going to be a revolution, and there was going to be a gigantic redistribution of wealth, of land, and of property. But the very young, fragile People's Republic of China still needed some members of the old status quo to stick around at least for a while. So they didn't want every single industrial boss and every single foreign investor to leave immediately, straight after the 1st of October 1949. So they had this double message, as you say. To their own supporters, they told this very radical story about gigantic redistribution of wealth and social power. But to the existing status quo establishment, those members who they felt could be co-opted and persuaded to stick around for a while were told a story about how China needed their patriotic support, needed their technology, needed their investments, was going to remain open to the world, that China would be pragmatic, that its job was to get rich and strong and to feed its people rather than really focus on politics. And that double message very quickly came unstuck. And some of the big Chinese industrialists and foreign investors who did stay, or in some tragic cases were persuaded to return to China soon after the revolution in 1949, ended up within a couple of years more or less losing everything, either volunteering in inverted commas to give their companies to the Chinese state, or just being kind of thrown in jail and having their property expropriated. Now, there are not, Red Army troops about to take away General Motors factories or confiscate, BASF chemical plants. We're not at that point. But I do think that this year, which is the 100th centenary year of the founding of the Communist Party, with July the 1st being the exact date, which will be a gigantic kind of domestic propaganda sort of extravaganza, they have the same problem, which is that they need to tell a story to the public in China about how, they have this phrase about, without the Communist Party, there would be no new China. That for all of the kind of twists and turns that communist rule took, particularly in the sort of the worst days of Mao, that fundamentally, if you are Chinese and you're proud of China being strong and advanced today and having aircraft carriers and nuclear missiles that can hit American cities and to be able to land spaceships on the surface of Mars, that all of that rejuvenation, all of that return to China's natural place at the top of the kind of table of great powers, that all of that was absolutely sort of inseparable from 70 years of continuous Communist Party rule over the People's Republic of China. And so that extremely political message, talking as, we hear from Xi Jinping and other leaders about the need to transmit the kind of the red revolutionary fire to next generation, the need to have more political education in, nursery schools, primary schools, universities, workplaces, the need to encourage red patriotic tourism. There are dozens of former Communist Party bases, sort of scenes of battles and long march kind of defeats, which at the moment are absolutely heaving with tour groups often dressed in kind of the pale blue kind of replica uniforms of the 8th Route Army, You see these kind of, dozens and dozens of slightly overweight Chinese officials dressed as Red Army soldiers from the 1930s, kind of puffing their way around these red tourism sites and singing revolutionary songs. It's a very, very political, revolutionary message. But at the same time, somewhat like 1949, they still want foreign technology. They still want foreign investments. For instance, their stated goal to make the Chinese economy net carbon neutral by 2060, China on its own does not have that technology. It's going to need it from places like the European Union. And it needs companies to believe that China is the best source of future growth for them, and that it is a reliable and stable partner, and that it's worth investing the next €1 billion or 10 billion euros in building a state-of-the-art plant somewhere in China to service the China market and maybe export markets too. But that message has to coexist with this very political, very nationalist message, not just about the strength of the Communist Party and the importance of party rule, but also about, as we said before, self-reliance and China not wanting to be dependent on the West. And really, to boil it down to the kind of the core double message, China's leaders have at various times over the last 12 months given speeches in which they have essentially said, in order for China to have the economic power to deter foreign countries from picking a fight with China or defying China's wishes, China has to make sure that as many foreign countries and companies as possible are dependent on Chinese markets and Chinese growth. But at the same time, China must not be dependent on any foreigner for anything that is crucial to China's national or economic security. And that kind of double message of, we need you to be dependent on us, but we have no intention of being dependent on you, isn't great for countries' long-term trust that China is just another big economic giant that is going to fit into the existing world order in ways that are basically benign and not disruptive. The disruptive effects of China's rise are becoming increasingly clear. But at the same time, China's story about being where the growth is extraordinarily potent. And especially after a year of COVID laying waste to consumer demand in the West, there are a lot of companies, particularly, say, European companies, Asian companies, where their only unit that made any money last year was in China. And the profits that those China units are sending back to their headquarters are in some cases kind of keeping the entire multinational corporation afloat. So China's market power has never been so visible. But companies' doubts about whether they are welcome in the long term have never been so acute.